This program, of course, is presented by Pro Wrestling Illustrated, the most widely read, widely sold, and respected wrestling magazine in the world today.
This is the Pro Wrestling Illustrated Podcast. I'm your host, PWI senior writer Al Castle, joined once again by my co-host, contributing writer Brian Solomon. How's it going, Brian?
Not bad, Al. Hope everything's going all right with you.
Yes, things are definitely looking brighter, at least in our parts. I got to visit the great state of Connecticut last Saturday. I was, I guess, around your way because, unlike New York, Connecticut opened up movie theaters. So I took a drive to one of the things I've missed the most during all this is movies, and I saw that a theater relatively close to the New York line was showing Tim Burton's Batman, so ventured out to Greenwich.
I think I saw the post that you put up about that. I was very jealous because I haven't been back to the movies yet, and I'm sort of like, I'm conflicted. I really want to go back, but I'm just so like scarred from all these months of being in my house. I don't know if I'm ready yet.
Well, there were probably more people in your house than there were in the movie theater, so I don't think there was much to worry about. I mean, it was the four of us, my family, and one guy way in the back who I don't think even made it to the end of the movie. So, not much to worry about. At least that's the thing, is that there's no movies to put out. So even the theaters that are opening don't really have anything to show. So I guess they've got to kind of get creative with what they put on. Also joining us, Raj Giri, proprietor of WrestlingInc.com. We got a lot of news to talk about, so I was sure to reach out to Raj. How's it going?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good. Thanks for joining us. And as I just said, a whole lot to cover. As if the not just the wrestling world, but the world in general wasn't crazy enough. We get just really since Brian and I we last spoke. I guess some of this was already going on before then, but it really kind of kicked in a major way over the last week. The hashtag Speaking Out movement with wrestlers, both men and women, but mostly women, coming forward with all kinds of accusations of sexual misconduct from people in the wrestling industry. And just a tremendous impact on the business over the last week. I don't think there's one major promotion in the U.S. or the U.K. that hasn't been affected by it to varying degrees, from some losing their top stars to some shutting down. So, again, as if there wasn't enough going on, this sort of like apocalyptic world that we're living in. We've got this to deal with now, so we'll try to break that down as much as we can here in the coming moments. We're also going to talk about the latest with the COVID-19 pandemic, some big news coming out of that too, with the positive tests out of WWE. Some have described it as kind of an outbreak in WWE. We know of at least three performers that have come forward and acknowledged that they've tested positive, but then lots of reports that there are many more, and a real question about what, if anything, WWE does differently going forward, and this affects AEW as well. So we'll talk a bit about that. Right now, let me quickly tell you about Pro Wrestling Illustrated. The current issue right now is the August 2020 issue with Drew McIntyre, the WWE champion, on the cover. It's our WrestleMania coverage issue with Brian's feature on the real winners and losers of WrestleMania. Lots more in here that you'll want to check out. My interview with Nyla Rose, features on Jacob Fatu, on Keith Lee. But pretty soon, I think by next week, the next issue will be out. I think it's the October issue. And another big one, this is our PWI poll, the top 50 kind of burning questions in the industry we pose to our subscribers. I compiled it, put together. Again, in this crazy world we're living in, we tried to reflect as much of current events as we could at the time. Certainly with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot in there about how people feel about how the sport's gone forward in the middle of the pandemic. So you'll want to check that out. I've got, I guess we could say now, I've got a hot seat interview in there with Charlotte Flair, and she's in the news also as well. Some bad news with her taking some time off, but we conducted this interview a few weeks ago, and she was pretty candid, talking about her place in the sport, her move, brief as it was, I guess, to NXT, her relationship with Andrade, the prospect of maybe following Becky Lynch's footsteps and starting a family. So a lot in there. You'll definitely want to check that out. and a lot more. That is the October issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated, coming out soon, early July, the digital edition at least. And whether you want the digital edition or the print edition, go to pwi-online.com and pick it up. You could just pick up the one or subscribe, and the longer you subscribe for, the deeper the savings. You get half off the cover price. It is absolutely the way to go. And again, the place to go is pwi-online.com. We've also just started work on the issue after that issue, which is the especially big one, the PWI 500. Have you started on your profiles yet, Brian?
Oh yeah, I'm almost done, Al. I'm really.
Wow, you're way ahead of the game.
I'm a speed typer. I thought you knew that.
Yeah, I just really started in the last couple of days. I've got to deal with the top 10, and that includes like the top 5 moments of the year for all these guys, and it's actually pretty work intensive. So yeah, I've just kind of started to dip my toe in, but this every year, welcome to this kind of thankless effort. It's going to eat up a lot of your summer. Maybe not. It sounds like you're almost done. So maybe you got out of it easier than others. But yeah, that's around the corner, and you don't want to miss that one for sure. So again, pwi-online.com. You can send us an email at pwi@kappapublishing.com, or to the podcast, PWI Podcast @outlook.com. You can follow us on social media at official PWI, both on Instagram and on Twitter, and find us on Facebook. Subscribe to the completely free PWI weekly newsletter put together by our new editor-in-chief, Kevin McElvaney. You can do that also at the website. There's updated news in there, thoughts, opinion from the staff, and some fun kind of throwback features from PWI classic editions, all in the format that longtime readers would be familiar with, the weekly format. What else? Pick up the T-shirt, the PWI T-shirt, or the Wrestler T-shirt. We've got a few now at ProWrestlingTees.com. I think that about covers it. Did you see, Brian? We got a little bit of a shout out on this week's AEW Dynamite. A couple of our colleagues were set to cover a press conference.
I know. I was amazed, and I have to say that Matt Brock really, I don't know what that guy's secret is. If it's the fountain of youth or whatever, but he is just aging really gracefully. He sounded like he had to be in his 30s, which I figured he's got to be around 80 by now. I mean, that's incredible, really.
All that drinking and smoking and to still be able to sound so youthful, really something. Yeah, I don't know how they get these sweet gigs being sent to Florida to cover press conferences when they barely work these days. I mean, when's the last time you saw either of them? I feel like really have a conversation with Kevin.
Here I thought that they retired, and next thing I know, they're at a press conference. So, I have a bone to pick about this. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. So, Raj, Brian, let's talk about speaking out. A couple weeks ago, this wasn't even a thing, and it's since then affected the business like few things in my lifetime. In terms of this fallout. Just very quickly, I believe this started in the UK with. Am I right about that, Raj? I mean, what were the origins of the speaking out movement?
It really started with allegations against David Starr, and which led to basically all the promotions that he was involved with dropping him, stripping him of the various titles. David Starr is a very big star in the UK, and essentially, I've got to think his career is over. Mm-hmm. And then that prompted a lot of women to come out and speak out against, as you mentioned earlier, people in all, the major promotions from WWE, AEW, ROH, Impact, and almost all of those promotions have, either released talent or suspended talent that were involved in some of these accusations. So it's a very serious thing. The accusations, vary in degree of severity. Some are, outright rape and sexual assault. There are others that are verbal abuse. There are others that it's just kind of things are legal, but it's also very sketchy. So it's it was really crazy how many people came out during this, because I always thought it was interesting during the Me Too movement. We really didn't see much in professional wrestling with that. You didn't see people coming out during that time, and then this just sparked a gigantic movement.
Brian, what, if anything, is your takeaway about what this says about the culture of professional wrestling, which I think for the last several years, the narrative has been that it's cleaned up so much from the days of the 70s and 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s, where so much of the culture was the really heavy partying. And certainly in the 90s and to 2000s, we saw all the very young drug deaths. But again, the narrative, I feel like in the last 10 years plus, is like, no, everybody goes back to the room and they play video games, and they're all sort of like, drinking smoothies and almost kind of like this geek culture. But this shows that there is, or does it, that there is still a very dark side of this business.
Yeah, see, I had thought that too, what you just said, that things may have changed a lot. I worked for WWE between 2000 and 2007, and I'll just say that, there's probably nobody that would ever want me to write a book. I'll just say that and leave it at that. But, look, when this whole thing happened with Me Too, even a couple of years ago, I couldn't believe that wrestling, Raj, as you said, that wrestling seemed to kind of escape scot-free. And I remember thinking, my God, it's really only a matter of time, and there are going to be a lot of people that are shaking in their boots, because for the longest time, the wrestling business had this reputation of being such a closed community where things just went on unchecked. It was kind of like its own world, a very kind of amoral place. I mean, life on the road, and even honestly, extending even into the corporate culture, to be very frank. Just the attitude of the rules, the normal rules of society do not apply here. And I think what happens when you have a business like that, like with other businesses or other fields of endeavor, I think it tends to attract people sometimes who feel, this is a place where I can get away with this sort of thing, where I won't be called out, or things that normal people, quote unquote, in everyday life can't get away with. And so there's a lot of look, it's no secret. I mean, maybe the specifics are, but it's no secret that for generations, the business has sort of been a place where so many very depraved things went on. I mean, there's no secret about that. So, I mean, I think it's about time, that there is a reckoning for something like this. I mean, I also, of course, think, as with anything else, that we need to be careful, that there is a difference between someone being accused of something and somebody being guilty of something. And there's also a range of differences in what people are being accused of doing. But I think it speaks volumes that this stuff was going on for so long in the wrestling business, with just this attitude of, well, that's just the business. That's just the way it is. And, look, I'm even guilty of that myself, working there and just being like, well, it's just the way it is. What are you going to do? Like, I can't change it. That's just the way that it is. But it seems like a lot of that is indeed going to be changing now. And I'm wondering where all the chips are going to fall and what the business is going to look like, because clearly, Al, these guys and gals were not just playing video games and drinking smoothies. Yeah. I mean, maybe, maybe it's not as bad. I mean, I don't even know, but maybe it's not as bad as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But clearly, we're not talking about, this is not like Jesus camp. You know what I mean?
Right. And a couple things on that. I don't know if it would have been worse 20, 30, 40 years ago. The biggest difference, I think, is that social media didn't exist, right? So This stuff all went completely unchecked. Yeah. But I do think that there is something about the current culture and the millennial generation, which some of what has led to this perceived cleaning up of the business, I think also contributes to this. I've always thought that one big difference between the current generation of wrestlers and the previous one was that when we were coming up, wrestlers were not fanboys, right? And that might sound like kind of like this derisive term, but they were more kind of mercenaries. They were pro athletes or ex-pro athletes and tough guys who were doing this to make a buck, right? I mean, they
absolutely.
it was a living. And I think they, as you touched on, they're probably attracted to some of the lures of this lifestyle, the drinking, the womanizing, all of that. But this is, the current generation has come up on wrestlers who grew up as fans and for whom it's like this privilege to be a wrestler. And I always think back to this interview that's already a few years old when WWE around the same time hired Kevin Owens, Finn Balor, I forget who else. Maybe it was, I think it was Pac. And it was just like, oh, we do this for free. Like what an honor and a privilege to work for WWE. And the point of that is that it all speaks, I think, to a kind of an immaturity, right? I mean, they, to borrow something that I've heard Dave Meltzer bring up a lot in the last few days when talking about this, that I completely agree with, is it's this high school mentality. That's what it feels like. And as much as some of these accusations are absolutely predatory and as bad or worse than I'm sure what was going on 30 years ago, 40 years ago, a lot of it is just this kind of teenage vindictive kind of behavior, just emotionally immature in dealing with sex, with relationships, and it's not to minimize any of it. In some ways, it makes any worse. But to me, that's as different as all these accusations are. The one thing that I think is consistent throughout almost all of them is that it's grown-ups acting like a bunch of teenagers. And I think it speaks to what you said, that I don't know if it attracts those types or they become those types, but it speaks to a lack of a sort of a foundation in the real world and the responsibilities of, being married and raising kids and paying a mortgage and working 9 to 5 and having to like cut your grass and make dinner. These are like kind of a bunch of Peter Pans, right? I mean, their job is to play fight in this sort of fantasy world and don't appreciate sort of the real consequences of what they're doing. So they're out there doing a whole lot of stupid things.
I think the high school thing is really apropos. I mean, ironically, it was a wrestler from the older guard. When I worked at WWE, I remember Scott Hall, and he would know, telling me, I'll never forget this. He said, if you never want to leave high school, this is the perfect business to get into. And I don't know, and he might have meant something a little different back then, but it does speak to the fact that I think the older generation, it was more of what you'd like a classic kind of jock mentality of what you'd see. And I think a lot of what was going on might have been similar to what was happening in maybe professional sports, or even more so in the rock and roll world, a lot of things that were happening. Whereas now, a lot of it, look, to be even more blunt than what you said, what you have now a lot of times, and I mean this in the most in the least offensive way, is you have marks as wrestlers. And I take full responsibility for that statement, but very often you do. Whereas the older generation of wrestlers, they were not as much of what you'd call classic fans. They were people, they were jocks trying to make a living. A lot of guys that maybe had been football players or had been wrestlers in school or were just, tough guys, bouncers in bars. And I think that created a whole different set of problems. But now, like you said, you've got a business that's full of kids, kids in almost every sense of the word, and they're now being protected, at least up till now, and insulated by being in this bizarre kind of bubble of professional wrestling where it's like your development as a human being is sometimes kind of arrested,
Yeah, so it's just a term that I thought, arrested development. Yeah, it's sort of a Lord of the Flies kind of thing within the whole wrestling world. Yeah.
One of the things that's changed a lot from the old days is there was a lot more drug use and things like people getting roofied. There's stories, or Missy Hyatt talks about women that were roofied and find themselves in the hallway and things like that. Whereas now a lot of these allegations, it's more liquor and not drugs, and it's people partying, getting wasted, and yeah, and a lot of serious things happening. People who you talk about that high school mentality, people just not growing up, or just you're just seeing a dark side to a lot of this, to the business in general.
I think it's a really good point about the drugs versus the booze, and I think this generation, which again maybe fancy themselves a little cleaner, more straight edge than the previous one, thinks, we're of legal drinking age and we can drink, so we're not doing anything illegal, but along the way making a bunch of really bad alcohol fueled decisions. Raj, what do you see as the fallout beyond, the wrestlers being suspended, being fired? Again, in the case of Chikara and Mike Quackenbush, closing shop altogether, and I think maybe some other promotions have as well. But do you see policies put in place by promotions to protect against this, and what if anything can they be?
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of any time you have ugly stories like this or an ugly scandal, there usually is some good that does come out of it. After Chris Benoit, which was a horrific tragedy, you did see WWE take their wellness policy very seriously, and you did see a lot of changes. And the main roster, the lifestyle has changed. Decades over decades. And with this, I know you had mentioned Meltzer earlier. I know he talked about, wrestling schools requiring people to be 18 to join. I think that's I'm surprised that doesn't happen already because of what you're doing. It's very different than, a karate school or anything like that when you're taking bumps and, having people slam you into turnbuckles and things like that. So I think that's a great start, but also companies need to really push for talent to speak out to them when something happens. And they need to take action immediately and not act like they're covering and hold talent accountable. And I also think, hopefully this allows for a lot of women to be able to come out and also go to the authorities, if they are a victim of sexual assault or rape, to go to the police immediately and know that they're not alone. This has happened to a lot of people, and speak out, because a lot of times with some of the talent, some of the allegations against them getting fired by a wrestling company is not enough, and there needs to be more. It should be noted also that for several of these allegations against talent, for instance, Matt Riddle, Jordan Devlin, they released statements saying that they strongly deny those allegations. Matt Riddle actually hired an attorney, claims that the woman has been cyberstalking him for years, and apparently WWE was aware that this about Riddle's claims against this woman. So, again, with allegations, it's very important to note that these are allegations. Nothing's been proven yet, but hopefully this will allow women to come out more, and men too. I mean, this is, I guess, it's not limited to gender, but if you're assaulted or being abused, to come out, and there's other that will, that share your story, and they're not alone.
Yeah, because the culture of the business has very often kind of protected the predators or made light of the behavior. There was definitely a lot of that. Like, I remember just hearing things that would, I was in my 20s, just kind of getting into the business and going on the road and working as a writer, and you'd hear things. And the worst part of it would always be the tone of it, where it would just be this hilarious story. And you'd think, like, my goodness, this is really not in any way hilarious, but you're afraid to say anything, and there's a lot of that would go on. I remember situations where female talent would have grievances where they'd wind up on the short end of the stick. They'd wind up being the ones suffering because of it rather than the people that they were accusing. That sort of thing went on quite a bit. I mean, look, it was so ingrained in the culture. I mean, not to make light of it, but I was watching the other day on WWE Network, speaking of Missy Hyatt, I was watching an old Clash of the Champions. And I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there was an incident they did. It was a backstage skit. It was played for laughs where Missy. Yes, with Stan Hansen. Yeah. She's this roving backstage reporter. She wanders into the locker room. Stan Hansen, in a towel, comes out of the shower, chases her down, and puts her over his knee and starts spanking her while she's like screaming and yelling, and kicks her out of the locker room. And it's just meant to be this hilarious bit, like we're at her expense. And it did not age well. Not that I think it was ever funny.
One of the spots you'd see all the time, I mean, well into the 90s and maybe even the early 2000s, was the forcible kiss on a woman who didn't want it. And that was a babyface move, right?
You just saw that on AEW not too long ago.
Yeah, and I think at the time people were like, wow, I can't believe they're still doing this. But yeah, I mean, it speaks to for as a lot of this is just the change in the culture generally. You know, being home so much the last few months, I've been binging a lot of old sitcoms, and a couple of them, you know, two of the most sort of beloved characters in American sitcoms, Sam Malone on Cheers and Joey Tribbiani on Friends. You couldn't do those characters now.
No,
I mean,
right.
They were just womenizers. They were, or the storylines would end with them in prison, I would think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the culture has definitely changed fast. You know, to your point, I mean, you used to have Hulk Hogan, you know, grabbing sensational Sherry by the hair and then giving her an atomic drop, and kids and their parents are cheering it on. I mean, even the Century with, you know, angles like the HLA and things like that.
Yeah.
Boy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, things change fast. Wrestling has changed a lot. I applaud WWE for a lot of the changes they've made creatively, because it is a lot more wholesome as a show and easier to watch with you know, your families and children than probably any time in the past in a weird way, even the 80s. Because the 80s, there was a lot of, you know, like I mentioned, the stuff with Hogan and Sherry and things like that would tell kids that was okay, and when it really wasn't.
Yeah, and then there was other stuff. There was, I think, a lot more overt racism and homophobia when you think about characters like Adrian Adonis. But you know, ironically, I think one of the things that is contributing to this whole problem now is actually a positive change in the wrestling business, and that's the inclusion of more women, right? So a part of this is a reflection of the locker rooms being more co-ed than ever before, right? I mean, this used to be mostly men on the road with other men, and there'd be, you know, essentially groupies. We know what they were called or have been called over the years in wrestling, and female fans. And there was always a handful of female workers, whether it was Sensational Sherry or Medusa or, you know, Moolah's crew, but you know, I don't know that it was even 10% of I'm sure it's much less than that, of any given roster. And now it's not quite 50-50, but, you know, one of the things you see all the time now that was really largely unheard of, you know, for most of my life following, is all these couples, all the and WWE, you know, you just look up and down the roster. Anytime somebody's in the ring, you're like, oh, that one is dating this one or is married to this one. And I think a lot of that is great, and I think it is you know, in my interview with Charlotte for the upcoming magazine, we talked about that, and I think how much it improves life on the road for a lot of these people to have a loved one with you and a little bit of your home on the road with you. You know, it could be less isolating, less lonely, but it also opens it up more to this kind of, I mean, certainly not the case that just having men and women together should lead to sexual misconduct allegations, but it's just a fact. You have more men and women together, you're going to have more issues having to do with sex coming up, including a lot of negative ones.
Yeah, I remember when I was there, I had a conversation once with somebody in talent relations. I don't even remember who it was, but I remember them telling me how it was actually giving them so many headaches because women on the roster, women in wrestling, it used to be almost treated like an oddity, like this rare attraction you'd have. But now that there was so many women and it was more of a co-ed thing, like you said, that they were having to field, and this is back then, so many more issues and problems and controversies and things with all the men and women being together on the road, whereas it wasn't so much of an issue before. And it was now this thing on their radar of all these fires that they always had to put out all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, likening back to the high school thing briefly, both my brothers went to all boys high school, a Jesuit high school in the Bronx, and I went to a co-ed public high school, and I envied them because it seemed so much more drama free, just being around other guys and removing all the drama that comes with hormonal young men and women interacting. And again, it kind of goes back to this metaphor of wrestling being high school.
And I do think there's still a long way to go as well as far as women in the business and how they're treated creatively as well, because right now, I mean, it just doesn't seem like enough the same amount of thought is given for the top women's angles as they are for the men's, and that goes across the board, whether it's WWE and AEW, and the women have proven not only can they headline, they can draw. I mean, Charlotte, her quarter hours when she was on NXT, there was a quarter hour where I believe she beat the week that Mike Tyson was on AEW. I believe her quarter beat Mike Tyson's quarter. So yeah, they can draw. Becky Lynch would usually see increases in her quarter hours. So I'd like to see more effort given in those storylines, and not just having to have one woman's storyline and no others. Having many. And yeah, I think we're getting there, but I feel like it took a step back after Ronda Rousey left, and hopefully it takes another step forward soon.
What happens to a lot of these women that come forward? I know so much of the focus has been on what happens to the accused, and in some cases it's clear that some of the careers are over. At others, I think there's a thought that they'll survive this. But I also wonder, especially with these aspiring women looking to come up in the business, whether this is held against them. And absolutely it should not. But there's the reality of the situation. If you are Vince McMahon or anyone else, do you want these people in your locker room who now have a history of, I'm using air quotes here, rocking the boat or being rabble rousers? You wonder if some of this is kind of weaponized against them.
So far, a lot of the people that have been doing the accusing, I don't think have been really on, and correct me if I'm wrong, because there have been a lot of accusations, but they are not names that you've heard of being, looked at by the major wrestling companies as far as WWE, AEW. Some have been fans, some are no longer involved with the business and were independent wrestlers that are no longer involved. But unfortunately, I do think that if there is someone that's a prospect, I could see WWE, AEW, being hesitant about signing them because of that. And that's unfortunate, but I could see that for sure.
Yeah. Let's quickly touch on not necessarily specific names, but specific situations in terms of the impact on the company, and a couple come to mind as just absolutely devastating. Over in NWA, they lost Dave Lagana, who was really, maybe the most important guy in the company. Brian, you and I have been big fans of what they were doing, at least before they had to all but shut down because of the pandemic. Do you see them getting past this?
Well, that's a very depressing situation. I mean, I really want them to. The logical side of me just sees this as being disastrous, partly because Lagana had been, even before the Billy Corgan era of the NWA, Lagana was very instrumental in keeping that brand alive, even going back 10 years ago after NWA had severed ties with TNA Wrestling and they were again kind of adrift. It was Lagana and Dave Marquez out in California that were keeping it going and even keeping them on television. So I don't know. I mean, this coupled with COVID and the fact that they haven't been able to tape, and then, of course, the Cornette thing months ago, I don't know. Like, I'm hoping, but I just don't see it. I hate to be that way. I hate that, especially because Dave Marquez is a good friend of mine. I really want them to succeed, but boy, is this a rough situation. Really bad.
Yeah, and I mean, this is less crippling, but just in terms of eroding at the company.
Yes.
Ricky Starks came over to AEW. I don't know if you just saw yesterday, Zicky Dice, who was their TV champion, leaving the company. So, it does not look good for the future of NWA. Another one I wanted to bring up, not necessarily directly related to the speaking out stuff, but I do think related to kind of world events and a shift in the culture. News just came out last night of Tessa Blanchard being released by Impact Wrestling. She's their heavyweight champion. I think it's absolutely devastating. And they also lost some talent to the speaking out movement. Michael Elgin, who was supposed to be challenging in the next pay-per-view, Tessa Blanchard in I think a 5-way match, and David Christ also. But to me, Tessa was all they had. Impact Wrestling without Tessa, they don't have anything that, or they don't do anything better than another company does it. So I thought their calling card was having this really powerful, credible female wrestler, the first ever women's heavyweight champion of a major American promotion. Am I overstating things, Roger? How big a deal is it for them to lose Tessa Blanchard?
I think it's gigantic. And to your point, also Joey Ryan was released. He had several, multiple.
It might be the worst of all, at least here stateside. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But regarding Tessa, I mean, she's arguably their biggest star. I mean, you could say that Ken Shamrock is more well known, but she is the one that matters the most right now. And it should be noted that her release had nothing to do with the allegations from earlier this year. Hers was they were at an impasse. She had been in Mexico with her fiance Daga. She was not able to make the Impact tapings. Now, whether it was her choice not to go or she couldn't, it shouldn't matter because we are in a pandemic and there's inherent risks with traveling. But apparently they wanted her to film some promos and things like that and said that she didn't do that. And so they decided to terminate her as opposed to suspend her, just strip her of the title. It's a huge loss for Impact. And I think one of the things that has hurt Impact over the years is their inability to keep top stars. And it's hard to follow the product when the roster is completely different every 6 months. And this is probably the biggest loss they've had in a long time.
And you just look up and down that roster, and there's tons of talented people there, absolutely. But there isn't that person that they can build around. I mean, are you really gonna? How excited do you get over Eddie Edwards or Sammy Callahan or even some of their younger prospects, Ace Austin or Trey or the other? I mean, they're very good, but none of those guys are going to carry this company and keep it on the radar the way Tessa Blanchard was, if only because the novelty of her being a woman.
Yeah, and I also think, when it comes to star power, in-ring only matters so much at a certain point. You have a ton of people that could have good matches and do cool stuff in the ring, but to be a star, you also need that charisma and connecting with the fans. And there's not many people that can do that, and Tessa was one of the very few in that company, and to lose that again, that's a huge blow. And she's had attitude issues reportedly in the past, which prompted WWE to pass on her. I've only heard positive things recently about her, over the last year or so. She would be a huge asset to another company. Whether past issues will affect that or not remains to be seen.
I think the WWE thing.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think the WWE thing was very telling because, she had been a part of the first Mae Young Classic, and she sort of had like future star written all over her and the whole pedigree, and it seemed like a natural feud with Charlotte Flair, at some point. But when they passed on her, I think it said a lot because she really does have that it factor, and
Right.
and it's, to me, I mean, God, correct me if I'm wrong, I can't think of another situation where a major company fired their world champion while they were champion. I can't even think of it.
I remember WWE suspending people while they were
Yeah.
champion. Rob Van Dam. I know,
But
they
just,
let.
you're gone. You're our top champion and you're fired. Goodbye.
Right. Yeah. I can't.
And I
can't-
wonder how much of it does have to do whether the recent issues with her kind of not cooperating and being stuck in Mexico maybe were the real impetus. I can't believe that this didn't have something to do with some of the remarks that came out last year, right around when she won the title, given the other kind of cultural crisis going on in the country right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And you don't want that coming up again. I mean, the comments that she was alleged to have made, and that might be too much baggage. I would think at least for a WWE to get nearer. AEW, she's got the connection with her dad working there. And as you said, I mean, reports are she's been on her best behavior, but that is real heavy baggage to be carrying around.
And it should be noted, she denies having said that. I mean, she was dating someone who was African American at the time, and that's not saying that she didn't say it. But she does deny that she said it. And I know Tommy Dreamer, who's close, working with her in Impact, says he doesn't believe that she did say that, and knowing her well. That being said, who knows? Maybe she did. But I do think the fact that she did deny it might make it easier for other promotions to hire her. Whereas if she issued, it's weird. It's one of those weird cases where if she had said she didn't and apologized, it probably would have hurt her worse denying it in a weird way. But
yeah, because right, she'd sort of have that on her resume.
Right.
I did this. Yeah. At least she has deniability. Moving on to the other cataclysmic,
real quick, I got a real quick point out. NXT, you were talking about the future of other organizations. NXT UK had just a barrage of accusations. They had fired Jack Gallagher last week, and then today they've released Travis Banks and Ligero. So both of them had accusations against them, and they are both gone.
And you got to think at some point WWE just cuts bait, right? I mean, it's what their vision was for NXT UK has not shaped out, and at some point maybe it becomes more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, originally it was just designed to counter program World of Sport and and not allow them to gain traction in the UK, but they were gone pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, I agree. It hasn't really panned out the way they thought. I know they wanted to use that as a springboard to open NXTs all over the world. They've been talking about India and Japan and the Middle East, and now who knows when you would be able to do something like that.
Yeah. So again, on to the next big crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the news this week of. What a shock. They start testing and you start getting positive results. And as I mentioned, we know of at least 3 in WWE. And honestly, in some ways, I can't think of 3 worse people to have it, just in terms of the potential impact. You've got Renee Young, who not only interacts with so many wrestlers in this backstage interviewing role, but is married to the top star of another company. So her testing positive potentially impacts 2 different major organizations, and then Adam Pearce, who again, as a road agent, is interfacing daily with the entire roster, and Kayla Braxton, another backstage interviewer. You're talking up close. I mean, we literally could have seen on television potentially the virus being transmitted. So
and Jamie Noble today came out as well.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah. What have you heard, Raj, in terms of estimates? I've heard everything from over 10 to a couple dozen? What do you think is sort of a good ballpark range?
So a wrestler that I communicated with, it actually sent me an email and said it's okay to post it. I can't mention his name, but he believes it's more than 2 dozen.
Really?
We're seeing plans for SmackDown tonight where half the show is now going to be Undertaker related.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly it's a significant number of talent that either have it or are awaiting a test or haven't taken a second test. It's just insane. WWE, they have the connections to be able to have been testing for COVID from the start, even when COVID tests were harder to come by. And to not be doing it, to only be doing temperature checks, especially since, as we see with Renee Young, Renee had tested negative on the WWE COVID test. And so it takes anywhere from 4 to 7 days for it to be traceable on a test. And you don't get symptoms right away. It takes several days. So if Renee Young started feeling those symptoms just days later, it's very possible that Jon Moxley could have gotten it, went to the AEW tapings, and it spread there. AEW, they have been COVID testing, but they're not practicing social distancing and masks.
No.
So anyone that was just infected within a couple days could get in and be spreading it and not showing up on those tests. So again, I was saying earlier with these scandals, hopefully leading to change. At least they are COVID testing now. They haven't had masks on for people in the stands. Hopefully that changes, and AEW as well. And it's so risky running during a pandemic. You're not seeing any major sport doing it other than the UFC and now NASCAR. But it's just we're at a country, we're not there yet. And I'm not going to get political or anything, but to even suggest slowing down testing at a time when cases are, we're experiencing a surge in the first wave, it makes no sense to slow down testing right now when that is a great way to prevent the spread, like we saw with Renee Young. Her getting tested, testing positive, prevented Jon Moxley from going to those AEW tapings and infecting who knows how many more people.
Yeah. And I got to say, as much as everybody's gotten on WWE, including us, rightfully so, I think the worst thing I've seen in recent weeks was out of AEW this past week, and when Jericho and Orange Cassidy fought into the crowd, and you saw all those people, zero social distancing, all sitting right next to each other, just like a wrestling show, just all together. And it had to be, I don't want to exaggerate too much, but it had to be 50 to 100 people. Very few of them wearing masks. They were not 6 feet apart. And it just, the obliviousness and the callousness of what's going on. And I think that part of this conversation, beyond just protecting your own employees and fans and their families and the people they interact with, is setting a good example. There's so few, as you touched on, live sports and entertainment going on in the world right now. They're on TV every week. And what do you see? You tune in and you see nobody wearing masks, nobody social distancing. And if you're a fan of them, you say, well, then I guess this is over, right? I guess I don't have to either, because it's not a thing. It's not important anymore.
I'm going to go so far as to say, and this is me saying this, but I'm thinking this is the moment where you say, okay, let's not run any shows, and I mean the whole business. It is incredibly tone deaf right now, and this outbreak that's happened within WWE is like, the most predictable thing ever. You're talking about the most high physical contact, field of human endeavor that you could possibly imagine. And it's like, look, it's time to just, and granted, I know, for example, like for indie promoters and things like that may mean the end of your business. That does not mean the end of WWE's business. They have hours and hours. They have a whole damn network built around how much content that they have. They could run shows to the, television shows until the end of time, best of shows, package shows, highlight shows, whatever they want to do. Even AEW could do, there is no reason to be doing this. It looks so incredibly bad, and it's incredibly reckless. I don't know about today, but I heard even as recently as last night, WWE still had not made an official statement. not even just externally, but internally to employees and things to let them know what the heck is going on and what they're going to do about it. I mean, it is chaos right now.
Yeah, I gotta say, Alfonso, I mean, I've been saying that from the beginning that they really shouldn't be running right now. But there is apparently Brian Alvarez is stated on the Wrestling Observer Live show that there is a clause that AEW has in their contract where TNT can terminate their deal if they're not producing new content. And WWE, if you remember earlier this year, or gosh, it feels like earlier this year, I guess it was just like a month and a half ago, but they were trying to run live every week because of their TV commitments. And, if they felt that if they breached those agreements, that Fox and USA could get out of their contracts. And that is the vast majority of their revenue now. And AEW, similar with the TV contracts, they're not profitable. If they don't have that TV contract, if they get dropped, that hurts them greatly right now as a company. So it's one of those really, iffy things. And I would think that WWE has a similar clause with their contracts. They got permission to not have to do the shows live, but I do believe that they feel like they have to be producing these shows, this first run content. Otherwise, there's a possibility of them getting dropped. And with these companies trying to save money, and AEW ratings are way down, WWE's ratings are way down. If they ever, I can't see USA doing it, but if Fox felt like this isn't worth the investment, they kind of regret it and want to get out and find a way to do it, I can see where Vince is worried. So the TV contracts makes it such a muddy issue.
Yeah. I'm going to go a little bit different direction, and if they all wanted to shut down, that's certainly understandable. It's certainly the safest route to go. But I also, in part from following UFC, do believe that there is a way to do this safely. I mean, again, none of it eliminates the risk completely, but I think even the most kind of progressive political leaders here in New York, Governor Cuomo, he's encouraged to some extent, like sports, to get back. Just there's a way to do it, taking the right precautions. We're just not seeing those precautions taken, and compare and contrast to everything UFC has done. I mean, they've just completely overturned their business model to take precautions. I know did some of it reluctantly, but you watch UFC now, and the cornermen or everybody has masks. Everybody not fighting pretty much has masks. No fans in the arena. Even interviews. One of the staples of UFC fight is Joe Rogan interviewing the fighter in the cage. They've even stopped that, and they have them in separate rooms, and they do it remotely. And it seems to me, in both major promotions, AEW and WWE, I think WWE certainly worse in a lot of ways. The only mitigation efforts we've seen are to protect the product. Like, how can we make this look as much as our regular product as possible, and not worrying about protecting wrestler safety. So let's pipe in the crowd noise, and let's turn up the lasers and everything else. But it's like, well, how about protecting the people in that building? And they've I mean, I don't want to say they've done nothing. They've done some things, but some of it's laughable. I mean, like we talked about it last week, Brian. They put up those plexiglass shields only to constantly be going over them and have wrestlers
into the crowd
up at each other. Yeah, I mean, why couldn't you, understanding that if you're going to put on a wrestling show, you're going to have two guys in a ring, in their underwear, basically all over each other. Probably the least safe thing you could do right now. Putting that aside, why couldn't everybody else in that building, short of the announcers, certainly, be wearing a mask? And other things, is it going to hurt the product somewhat? Yes, but you make do. Interviews, why can't you do them remote? Do you need an interviewer and the interviewee together next to each other? Backstage segments, all this things. I mean, I think you can and you should tweak them right now. Promo should be cut. A wrestler by himself cutting a promo going forward. There's a way to mitigate and minimize the risk as much as possible. It just seems they're not doing it all and have been moving in the other direction. I mean, there was the story right around when some of these positive tests came out that they let some fans back into a show, and like friends of wrestlers and families of wrestlers. just absolutely irresponsible.
Yeah, the protecting of talent and of employees and things like that has always been in the business, and especially with WWE, something that it seems like it needs to be kind of like forced or just come to a head before anything is done about it. Just being proactive or kind of trying to get ahead of something has never really been their strong suit. It's just not. I mean, look, all you need to know about WWE is the fact that it's the only, well, wrestling in general, it's the only television production where there are no credits.
Yeah.
No one even gets credit for the work that they do publicly. And it's just, and I know that seems maybe trivial to bring up, but I think it says a lot about the mentality behind the scenes and that you see.
It's interesting. The time they did have credits was Saturday night's main event. You remember that? They used to always have the credits.
But I think that was NBC that was forcing to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, because they were involved with the production. A lot of it was Dick Ebersol. So yeah.
But Steve Farhood, who I interviewed in the last podcast, touched on some of this. It's the lack of unions. It's the one thing that the combat sports that have gone forward during the pandemic all have in common, right? MMA, pro wrestling, and boxing. There's no collective bargaining, and beyond that, at least boxing and MMA have some regulation by sports commission. Pro wrestling is still in a lot of ways very much the Wild West. They're just have nobody to answer to and can just do what they want. And a responsible owner wouldn't need these regulations or this prodding by regulators and government to do this. You just do the right thing to protect your employees and your fans and the bigger picture, your business, your future. But we're not seeing. Well, we are seeing a lot of that, and that's worth noting too. I mean, New Japan just got up and running, just recently, taken all kinds of precautions, even though their coronavirus situation isn't nearly as bad as in the U.S. Ring of Honor is yet to get started. So we have seen some responsible promoting. I think it's just that the two biggest, most prominent ones, I guess the ones with the most to lose, not as much, and it's a shame.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're a talent after what just happened this past week, would you want to be working if you got children, loved ones, and family back at home and risking spreading it to them after this outbreak? I mean, I think with the union, you might not be seeing that happen. So I'm sure there are some that would still want to work, but I'm sure there are a lot that are afraid to speak out and are scared to death about having to go to work right now under these conditions.
And not to be like hyperbolic, but the stakes really couldn't be higher here, right? I mean, you're talking about the difference between people living and dying, and not just the people we see on TV anymore. I mean, just knowing let's say it is 20 people in WWE right now that are positive for COVID-19. You look at statistics, and there's a percentage of those 20 that will be essentially contagious, be super spreaders, and they could each infect some people, and then those people will infect some people, and the statistics also show you that the vast majority of those people will get better, right? I mean, they're going to struggle for a while, and then they'll come out the other side of this. But some will not, right? I mean, some people will die. And if that's the case, I mean, you could draw a line directly from some of these decisions made by major national wrestling promoters and people dying, right?
Yeah, and I think it's irresponsible also for both companies to be using people who are higher risk, whether it's Jim Ross, Jake the Snake, Ric Flair, Jerry Lawler in the past. At least they stopped doing that. But yeah, you're seeing this greed and this flagrant disregard for what's really going on out there, and it's unfortunate. WWE, for as much as they want to be compared to the big dogs, the NFLs and those leagues, and then they're doing this. It just looks like Bush League.
It
Yeah.
really exposes, I think, to the world that maybe wasn't even aware of it, just kind of like the carny fantasy land that professional wrestling is. You know,
Right, their
anybody
bubble.
anybody that's watching this is going like, wow, those guys are really like in their own world. What's happening over there? And we're all over here like, yeah, we know.
Yeah. But tying
At
it
the
all,
same time,
all
you
back
are seeing
together.
it in politics at the highest
Yeah.
levels as well.
True.
So it
Yeah.
is kind of all over the place.
Tying it all back together from the beginning of our conversation, and you just touched on it, Raj. They are in their own bubble, and I think it's in some ways ironic that WWE works so hard to try to be considered legitimate and have made some strides in recent years. You see them covered in Sports Illustrated on ESPN, but if ever there was a time where they have benefited from kind of being under the radar, it's the last few weeks. I mean, imagine a breakout of COVID-19, 10 to 30 people, whatever it is, in the NBA, and really it wouldn't even be the NBA. It'd be like one team, or going back to our other conversation, mass accusations of sexual misconduct in one industry like we've seen, and I've hardly seen anything in the mainstream news about any of this. So in that sense, they should be thankful that they are still not quite legitimate.
Well, it's the
Right.
same thing that we saw back in like the 90s and 2000s when a lot of people were saying the same thing about all the drug deaths. Can you imagine if NFL players or NBA or Major League Baseball players were dropping off at that degree? You'd have a congressional investigation immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those kind of stories where, like wrestling drug deaths were more relegated to, Entertainment Tonight and Extra, not the, not CBS News or anything like that. So, yeah, I mean, wrestling is kind of detached from the outside world. I mean, with this COVID stuff, yeah, you're seeing a lot of media on the internet, but that doesn't mean anything because it's ESPNs and those the evening news and the TV channels that are still the most viewed, the most watched, and you're not seeing really any coverage there, or very little.
In terms of some logistics, Raj, what if anything is likely to change, regardless if they want to or not? Because I think to some extent the changes that you'll see are going to be very much reluctant, right? But then there's also some stuff that just seems to be necessary. Another part of the news was the tri-state area here, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, requiring people coming from other states with high infection rates to quarantine for 2 weeks. And it's come up that, WWE's Brain Trust is here in the Northeast. A lot of wrestlers in both companies, I think Marceau and AEW, are based here in the Northeast. And you've got the infection rate in Florida spiking to historically high degrees right now. So do you think in the coming weeks we do see a change? Do both WWE and AEW, pick up shop and do they have to move to another state? Are they forced to shut down live television for some time?
I think both WWE and AEW, for the reasons we talked about earlier with the TV contracts, are going to do everything in their power unless they're absolutely forced to stop production to keep going. I do think AEW, it makes no sense why they have the fans in the stands so close to each other when there's clearly tons of seats and it's very open.
Right, you're still in a stadium. I mean,
Right.
In WWE Performance Center, I mean, it's excusable somewhat because it's this confined space. And to their credit, WWE is doing a better job in keeping their faux fans apart than AEW, where you've got all the space in the world in there. It's crazy.
Yeah, so that makes no sense. So obviously a first measure would be to separate them and have them wearing masks, show that you're serious. A second would be to stop using Jim Ross for now. I know Jim Ross probably still wants to do it, but sometimes you got to step in and take into account talents where they're at and their risk factor. And again, Jake Roberts, Tully Blanchard, WWE stop using Ric Flair right now. But I and it's kind of what you mentioned with UFC, with how they do interviews, because Renee Young, she's talking to all those people get it, they can spread it. So maybe doing split screen interviews. I don't know. Again, I just think I find the product pretty hard to watch as it is right now with no fans. But they might still need to go back to that with having no one in the arenas just to minimize the risk.
Jake, it's not going to improve the product.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to remark. I think Jake Roberts, maybe I missed somebody. He seems to be the only person I've seen wearing a mask during the show, like during his segments, and not even consistently. But I did take note that when he would come out, he'd have a mask on, even when he was in the ring and stuff.
Yeah, I think that, and there was that segment with the Viking Raiders where Catalina was wearing a mask. Those were the only two in like the last 2 months that I could come up with.
Well, with Britt Baker, they're literally making a joke out of it.
Right.
Yeah. No, I mean AEW, absolutely. I don't want to overstate things, but they have a lot of fault here too. And in some ways, I mean, they were testing before WWE was testing. That's a good thing. And I think they were more conscious at times about the social distancing thing. But I've seen them backtrack a lot in the last few weeks and just do some really irresponsible, reckless stuff. So hopefully they all get their act together. All right, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate both of you helping out here this week. So much going on. I look forward to the days that we could just talk about like wrestling matches and stuff like that.
Awesome promos and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Raj, anything you want to plug before we leave here?
Just keep checking out WrestlingGeek.com. We got a ton of exclusives, good stuff. We got an interview with Ric Flair. We had a recent one. I'm sorry. There's just so much going on that.
Here's Rick now.
Okay. But yeah, we have just tons of interviews, tons of exclusive interviews, and a bunch of cool stuff coming up. So keep checking out WrestlingGeek.com.
Yes, a friend of the magazine for sure. You're our go-to for news, so we appreciate it. Brian, thanks so much. Both you guys, stay safe, and we'll be back soon.